29,000 people are dying early in the UK each year because of air pollution. That's according to government figures. The EU has introduced tough targets on pollutants, but the UK is failing to meet the levels required. Earlier this year, the government admitted that in 16 places right around the country, from Glasgow to Southampton, the EU targets will not be met until 2020 or even 2030. The environmental organisation Client Earth took legal action saying the government has failed in its duty. Now the European Court of Justice has ruled that Britain has an obligation to meet the targets. Joining me to discuss what should happen next, Client Earth's lawyer Alan Andrews and Roger Helmer as UKIP spokesman for energy and industry. Alan Andrews, to you first, the significance of this judgment.
Well, I think this judgment is hugely significant. The European Court has ruled that people in Britain, as EU citizens, have a right to breathe clean air, and the national courts in Britain have a duty to uphold that right. So what we're going to see now is much more urgent action to tackle the problem, and that will have huge benefits for human health.
Roger Helmer, what do you make of this judgment?
Well, in a sense, the court decision is merely a truism. You can read the limits actually in the law. We're in excess of the limits, so technically we're in breach of the law. The question is, are the regulations appropriate? Can we practically live with the consequences of them? And should Britain be subject to laws made in foreign institutions in the first place?
And those are questions hopefully we'll get to. But Alan Andrews, what is the problem here? What is so bad in the UK that we don't seem to be able to meet these targets?
In a word, diesel. The nitrogen dioxide problem in the UK is overwhelmingly caused by emissions from diesel transport. The problem in the UK is that the government has encouraged people to drive diesel vehicles instead of petrol, and they're far more polluting, sometimes by more than 40 times a petrol equivalent car.
We all want to breathe clean air, Roger Helmer. Would you agree that these EU targets are a good thing? That's what they're aimed to do, after all.
Not at all. We agree that we want to stop pollution, and I will qualify that by we're talking about sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide, particulates. From our point of view, we are not talking about CO2, which we do not regard as a pollutant. I want to make that point very clear. Of course we want to reduce them, but we must reduce them in a way that doesn't actually disrupt the life of citizens and place undue burdens on industry. You know, if we go to those drivers and say you may not start your car, they may have second thoughts about air quality.
Are there signs that European law on air quality is having that impact, that it is, in other words, damaging industry or stopping people driving cars or whatever? Are we at that stage, or is that something you fear is on the horizon?
Well, we've seen speed limits imposed upon motorways with the declared objective of reducing pollution, which is a terrible waste of resources. It's an inefficient way to drive. The one place that it's efficient to drive fast is on motorways when there isn't a traffic jam on them. The other point I'd like to make in response to Alan, he says that the government persuaded people that they should drive diesel cars. Excuse me, it was the Green lobby that pressed for diesel because it reduced CO2 emissions. So 5 years, 10 years ago, we were saving the planet by driving diesel. Today, we're killing ourselves by driving diesel. As a motorist, I am sick to death of being given different messages.
I mean, that does seem to be a problem, doesn't it? That we went for diesel in a big way in the UK. Something was wrong with that. The message was wrong, whether it was the Green groups to blame or the government.
Well, quite simply, that was a mistake. We thought diesel was the way to go because it had lower carbon emissions. What we didn't realise, but what we should have realised, was the major health impacts associated with diesel. So that was a policy mistake, one that we should have seen coming a long time ago and change direction.
So
it's very good of Alan to admit that it's a policy mistake, but I could sit here for 10 minutes and tell you about other policy mistakes that are coming out of the Green lobby, the excessive use of renewables being extremely high on that list. There is just a whole litany of errors made by the Green movement. They want to save the planet, and we end up doing daft things that damage the economy.
Alan Andrews, what's your advice then to the government faced with this issue of, you know, we have way too many diesel cars, pollution levels way above the level we're meant to have in Europe? What should be done about it? And, you know, they don't seem to be able to get grips with it so far.
I mean, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet. There's no one magic policy that's going to solve this problem overnight. What we need is a comprehensive plan to clean up diesel transport. A national system of low emission zones, like the one that's being proposed for London, is one solution that would have a major benefit. The way a low emission zone works is it bans or charges certain types of vehicles from entering a highly polluted area unless they meet a certain emission standard. So that's what the Mayor is proposing for London. If it's good enough for London, it's good enough for all the other towns and cities in the UK, which are also failing to meet these limits and also suffering all the health problems we've talked about.
Roger Helmer, you don't agree with the EU dealing with this problem, so how would you do it differently? Because I think you accept that there is a problem here, that these nasty air pollutants, as you mentioned earlier, nitrogen dioxide and so forth, are a problem. They're causing people to die prematurely, and something needs to be done about it.
I mean, what we would like to do is to see a British government working with British industry and with British medical institutions and so on, and looking at what makes sense for our country in order to get clean air for our people. And we have a different country, we have different population density, we have different industries. The rules that apply in rural Germany may be entirely irrelevant in urban bits of Britain.
Alan Andrews, would you accept that argument?
No, not at all. Whether we live in Britain or Germany or America or Japan, we still have the same physiology, we still suffer the same health effects from air pollution. We suffer from asthma, lung cancer, heart disease, strokes, regardless of where we live. And the point that air pollution is less bad in the countryside, well, frankly, that's irrelevant. The vast majority of the population live in our highly polluted urban areas where the pollution is worst.
I'd like to move on slightly to air pollution laws that are on the horizon. Alan Andrews, to you first. The EU is considering further future targets. What would you like to see come out of Europe now on top of what we already have?
Well, first we need to enforce the laws that we've got in place as a very minimum safeguard for human health. But what the science is telling us now is that the current EU limits are actually inadequate to protect human health. They need to be stricter. But for us to achieve those, what we really need to start doing is looking at the overall emissions from Europe. We need to start looking at the transboundary pollution, the pollution that knows no national borders. And to do that, we need the National Emissions Ceiling Directive, which has been proposed by the Commission. We're starting to hear some worrying noises that it might be scrapped.
Okay. Roger Helmer, isn't there a logic of dealing with pollution on a Europe-wide basis when pollution clearly crosses borders?
Well, no, I mean, this sort of pollution is localized pollution, and therefore it is not relevant to crossing borders. I agree if you're worried about CO2, as I believe you probably are. That is a global issue, and a ton of CO2 in Taiwan is the same as a ton of CO2 in Turin. But
is that the case? Is that the case, Alan Andrews? Is pollution localized and doesn't go cross-border?
Nitrogen dioxide, the pollutant issue in our case, is relatively localized. Other types of pollution which are harmful to human health, particulate matter, SO2 that Roger mentioned, have a very big transboundary impact. Everyone remembers
the problem. They have a cross-boundary impact. Need to be dealt with perhaps on a cross-border basis.
Point here?
Do they need to be dealt with on a cross-border basis, given the fact that
let me make an important point. You mentioned earlier on that 20-something thousand people were said to die early as a result of air pollution. Let's remember that in Britain, and I believe across Europe too, life expectancy is going up by leaps and bounds. So this idea that we're all subjected to terrible pollution that's killing us off, no, we are not. We are getting healthier, we are living longer, that is all good. The exhaust from cars is incredibly clean to what it was 20 or 30 years ago. Industry is being controlled. Things are getting better.
We're running out of time, but just a couple of points I'd like to finish on. You mentioned it earlier. There are rumours from President Juncker, the President of the European Commission, that these new air pollution targets may be scrapped. He may not pursue this legislation. How much of a concern is that to you?
Well, it's a huge concern. I mean, yes, we need action at the city level and at the national level, but we also need to take care of the transboundary pollution. That will require the National Emissions Ceiling Directive. If that's scrapped, we're looking at not having any new legislation on the table for the foreseeable future, and that will have major impacts for human health.
If there is a case for transboundary agreements, and there may well be, We in UKIP would say we are very happy with that, provided we have agreement on a voluntary intergovernmental basis. What we fundamentally object to as an affront to democracy is undemocratic, unaccountable institutions, foreign institutions in Brussels, making decisions that are imposed on our country. We can't accept that. We won't accept that.
We're going to have to leave it there. We've run out of time, but thank you very much. Thank you very much, both of you, for joining me. Thank you.